Today we will be looking at Europe in the period 1500 to 1750 CE, and we will be focusing specifically on cultural and technological change as well as political developments during the period. So we will begin by looking at the scientific revolution and the age of reason. What is the scientific revolution? In brief, it's a new method of understanding the world. Truth prior to the scientific revolution was defined as that which is found in the Holy Scripture. But truth becomes redefined during this period, and it is something that has to be assembled piecemeal, primarily through investigation. Science, as we understand it today, is a collaborative effort, and it builds upon work that previous scientists have done. So a contemporary of Galileo was a man named René Descartes. And Descartes, you are familiar with his work, even if you didn't realize it, because Descartes invented the coordinate plane, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner. He is most famous for an expression of his, or at least is attributed to him. And in Latin, it is cogito ergo sum, and that is translated in English as I think, therefore I am. He divided all of reality into really two categories: matter, everything you can see and touch and observe, and spirit, which is sort of the realm of religion. He preferred deductive reasoning, and we'll look at forms of reasoning in a moment. And he was another person who saw mathematics as being above all else, and both mathematics and mechanical engineering are sort of the center, or the basic substance of the universe. The only thing that he couldn't explain with mathematics, though, was life, which is kind of a big gaping hole in his theories. Following on from that, we have Pascal, who, again, depending on what level of mathematics you're currently taking, you may have heard of. But ultimately, what he landed on is the idea that, and this was a really radical idea that threatened the authorities, that God really doesn't fit in the scientific world, and that's a challenge that a lot of scientists have grappled with ever since Descartes and Pascal, and the scientific revolution overall. Uh, we also have Sir Francis Bacon working during this period. He preferred inductive reasoning to deductive reasoning. So let's look at reasoning for a little bit, because you engage in both of these all the time. And in fact, animals in general, depending on their level of intelligence, engage in inductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning, the basic idea here, this, and you do this in science labs all the time, is you observe, you collect data, and then you draw conclusions from that. So, for example, if I use Google Slides for all of my lectures and there is a lecture tomorrow, then I'm probably going to use Google Slides in the lecture tomorrow. So that's bottom up logic. The other side is deductive reasoning, and that's what we refer to that as top-down logic. And that's where you start with a premise and then you develop a conclusion based on the premise. So, for example, everybody in the class plays guitar. So there's a premise. Mary is in this class. That is a fact. Therefore, Mary plays the guitar. So I drew my conclusion based upon the premise and the fact that followed from there. And so, again, we use both inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning all the time. And if you ever choose to slow down your own thinking process, you'll see that you engage in both of these types of reasoning all of the time. So Sir Isaac Newton is probably the GOAT of the scientific revolution, because he took all of the previous ideas coming out of the scientific tradition and synthesized them all. He spent most of his time, as you may know, looking at gravity, and he recognized gravity as a fundamental attractive force in the universe. He invented calculus, so you could either thank him or condemn him, depending on how you feel about that particular course. Uh, that calculus was to be able to explain how bodies that are moving independently of one another can interact. He created most famously the three laws of motion, which I'm guessing you have some familiarity with from taking physics in ninth grade, if you did so. And those three laws of motion are: objects in motion stay in motion. Changes in motion are proportional to the force which is applied to the object, and actions produce equal and opposite reactions. And his basic model of the universe has never been contradicted in the 300 years since he posited it. When we look at the scientific revolution, we also want to look at new technologies, as we do in each period. And again, these technologies reflect the things that are happening in this era. So, one of the things that is happening in this era is the age of exploration, where Europeans get into more technologically sophisticated ships and begin to explore the world. And two items of technology that made that possible were the quadrant and the astrolabe. In addition, we have the development of more accurate and sophisticated cannon and artillery, which again, this is a period of lots of war. So that's another technology that you would invent during that period. And then new mining technology. And most of those innovations took place in the Americas, of course, conducted by Europeans. And the goal there was to be able to extract as much gold and silver as possible from the earth. And so you have efforts at chemically separating the metal from the rock, as well as hydraulic pumps to be able to pump groundwater out so that then you can access the minerals within the earth. Moving into a little bit more of philosophy, we're going to look at a man named Thomas Hobbes, and he was an Englishman who was writing during the Civil War period that we looked at in a previous lecture. And he has some foundational beliefs, starting with the idea that we as a species are social animals, and we all wish to maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain. I think it would be difficult to disagree with him on those first 2 points. His third point is that we are constantly in competition with one another for scarce resources. That's another one that's hard to argue with. And that if we didn't have society, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. And therefore, we have a social contract. And what we do as in a society is that we exchange our personal freedom for security that we would get from society. The place where we diverge perhaps a little bit is that he felt that the best way to maintain a secure society is to have absolute government. So, no freedom, no democracy. You have an absolute ruler. Hobbes was hated by everybody because even the absolute rulers, who you would think would go along with that, didn't agree with some of his other ideas about the human race. So nobody liked Hobbes during his life, but it's hard to argue with at least some of his ideas. The next person that we will look at is John Locke, and this is just going to be part one of John Locke because Locke has some really, really important connections to, among other things, the creation of the United States of America. And he's kind of the opposite of Hobbes, and he's writing in a different period. So Hobbes was writing during that English Civil War, so a time of war, a time of strife. Locke is writing during an era of peace called the Glorious Revolution, which we'll be looking at later in this lecture. So he believes that in a state of nature, we are actually a cooperative species, that we work together for mutual gain, and that we try to create a society where we will all have communal benefits, and that the ruler is given his power by the people. And the goal there is to secure the welfare of the greatest number of people. And this is a very important point. Locke believed that a ruler could be removed or deposed if they violate the public trust. And that idea is literally in the American Declaration of Independence, that we have the right to overthrow our leader if we don't like them. Uh, Locke also believed that the mind is a blank slate, and that the best thing that you can do for society is to educate the people. And again, he was very much an inspiration for that which Thomas Jefferson was writing back in 1776. So we're going to move on from the scientific revolution and spend some time looking at politics of Europe in the period 1500 to 1750. Now, in a previous lecture, we already did look at politics in the context of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and all of the political impacts of religion in Europe. But we're going to spend some time just looking at governmental structures. So we're going to look at the House of Bourbon in France, and this is a royal family that lasts for a couple of hundred years. It has nothing to do with the alcohol of the same name. And the Bourbons believed in absolutism in politics and mercantilism in economics. And just as a review, mercantilism is the idea that that a country's colonies exist only for the economic benefit of the mother country. And so all trade coming from colonies has to go back to the mother country. The Bourbons believed that the way to establish stability is with a big army and a centralized state. Now, at the beginning of this period, France is not a centralized state, but we'll see how that grows. They believe in the concept of having a social pyramid with the king on the top. So you have, of course, serfs and peasants would be at the very bottom, and then various levels of aristocracy in between. Uh, they've definitely believed in the concept of divine right, and divine right is simply that you have the right to rule, and that right to rule was given to you literally by God. Um, they had to work to maintain aristocratic support, and most of that was through funneling money to the aristocrats. The first Bourbon was a man named Henry IV, and he was king in the late 16th century. And one of the ways that he worked to maintain his power is that he bribed a lot of the aristocrats. There were a lot of economic problems in France during this period, and at least partly in consequence of that, he was assassinated. The second Bourbon was a man named Louis XIII, and he was dominated by his principal advisor, a man named Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu was the de facto ruler of France under Louis XIII for about 20 years. He was very much interested in helping to centralize the power of the king and expand the power of the king. And one of the things that he did is that he stripped nobles of their power in their fiefdoms, right? So we know that the basic structure of feudalism is power is ultimately decentralized, and the king relies upon the nobles to rule the local areas. Richelieu took that power away and established a new title called intendant. And an intendant is somebody who works directly for the king. He's appointed by the king. His responsibility is not to the local noble. His responsibility is to the king. And the intendant takes care of tax collection, which is a very important job, because usually the tax collector gets to get a percentage of the taxes. The intendant was responsible for justice and military recruitment and defense of the local area. So pretty much every responsibility that previously had belonged to the nobles, the intendant has now taken over. Richelieu also built fleets of ships to be able to engage in trade and also combat on the high seas. He used what's called deficit financing to build that army. And this is a way that, unfortunately, America also funds its government today, which is you sell debt to be able to raise money. And the idea is that at some point down the road, the government will pay people back for the money that they loaned to the government. So it's really not a smart way long term to run a government. But this is an issue that we're dealing with here today in America as well. He did not reform the tax system, however, and the tax system was very harsh, and poor people had to pay large sums of money, or trade goods, which is usually how they would pay their taxes. As a result of that, there were riots amongst the peasants because they felt that they were being significantly overtaxed by these new intendants. Both Richelieu and Louis XIII die within about a year of one another, and consequently, the throne of the Kingdom of France is handed over to a 5-year-old boy who is known as Louis XIV. So France in the late 17th century, so the late 1600s, it's important to understand it's not a unified state. Some of the provinces that are under the rule of the King of France had been independent entities as recently as a couple hundred years prior. And those older and more powerful provinces got a break on taxes, and part of that would have been related to the arrangements that brought those regions or those provinces into or under the authority of the King of France. As a consequence of that, there's a very unequal distribution of taxes. You have some provinces that, because of the deal that brought them into France, allowed them to pay very, very low taxes to the King of France. Other provinces had very, very high taxation. And as always, it's the poor that are hurt the most by these arrangements. Now, again, during this period, we have a child king, Louis XIV. He was 5 years old when he ascended to the throne. Now, common sense would tell you that you would not have a 5-year-old running the affairs of state. As a result, Louis XIV had a regent. A regent is just the name of an adult who rules on behalf of a monarch who, for whatever reason, age, infirmity, whatever, cannot rule for themselves. And so the regent under Louis XIV, at least until he came of age, was Cardinal Mazarin, and that was actually his mother's lover, which is weird because cardinals aren't supposed to have lovers. But he was hated by most Frenchmen because he was a foreigner, and there was this idea that you have a foreign influence who over your king, and obviously you would never want to be in a situation in which someone from a foreign country has power over your ruler. That would Most people would think that that's a really bad thing. If you were to open a dictionary and look for an example of an absolute monarch, the example that would be found there would be Louis XIV of France. His most famous quote is "L'État, c'est moi," which translates to "I am the state." So kind of the definition of an absolute ruler. I control everything. In order to be able to control everything, you need to have your people in positions to be able to control the society. And so that required a massive expansion of the bureaucracy. If you remember, bureaucracy is sort of the instrument of government, people who work for government who then go and execute the wishes of that government. So we do not have an absolute monarchy in America, but we do have a very large bureaucracy which exists to carry out the work of the state or the country overall. One thing that was very common under Louis XIV is simony. Simony is the purchasing or the handing out of political offices. So if you were very wealthy, or very connected, you could buy an office from the king. And once you have bought that office, then you get to execute the power of the state. So, for example, if you were to buy an office as a tax collector, well, ultimately you're going to make a lot of money there because you get to collect the taxes and then you can keep a decent amount of those taxes. Or what would sometimes happen is you would buy the office, by laying out the amount of money that the king expected to collect from a particular area, and then you could go out to that area and raise taxes and make even more money than the amount of money you gave to the king. There's not really any accountability or any capacity for reform under a system of government like this. And the government is very top heavy. You no longer have that decentralized system like you had under feudalism, where the local aristocracy has really all the political power in that particular area. That's not the case anymore. The aristocracy has been largely sidelined under this period. Um, Perhaps Louis XIV's most lasting legacy is the Palace of Versailles. Versailles had been a minor estate, and it's just outside of Paris. But the Sun King came in and he built this absolutely enormous palace. And because he referred to himself as the Sun King, there's sort of a sun theme to the Palace of Versailles. It's enormous. 700 rooms in the Palace of Versailles, but this is a period before indoor plumbing. So you have 700 rooms, but not a single bathroom in the entire palace, which you can imagine how disgusting that might get over a period of time. The photo is of a specific room at the Palace of Versailles called the Hall of Mirrors. And when we get to the early 20th century, this particular room is going to have very important significance in world history. Um, Nobles, since nobles don't have power anymore out in their lands, they got to figure out something else to do. And so a lot of nobles end up sucking up to the king and competing for some very interesting offices. So, for example, one highly coveted position was the position of being in charge of the king's footstools, and I kid you not. Um, just a note about the decor at the Palace of Versailles. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to live in a place that looks like what you see here in this image. However, I can think of one modern political leader who would probably really love the decor in the Palace of Versailles. One of the reasons why Louis XIV had to tax the crap out of France is that he liked war and he was an expansionist power. He was very interested in conquest. And so his first major war was called the Dutch War. And he invades the Netherlands because he wants to control trade. We know that the Netherlands is sort of the capital of banking and finance and trade in pretty much all, at least of Western Europe. He also wanted to conquer the Netherlands because he wanted to force it back into Catholicism. He also saw himself as a champion of Catholicism, and that's a part of his effort at conquest in the areas of Europe that were not already Catholic. He occupied portions of the Netherlands in the year 1672, and just as we saw when the Dutch were fighting back against the Spanish, we see the Dutch open the dikes in Amsterdam in the attempt to flood the city so as to make it impossible to conquer. The Dutch, in fact, did agree to concessions. They were looking to end the war, but Louis was unwilling to compromise and he kept the fight going. And that was a mistake because just as we saw the Dutch call in a noble named William of Orange when they were fighting the Spanish, we see them do the same thing. Not the same William of Orange, this would have been his, I don't know, son or grandson, but they call this noble back, and that William of Orange takes over control of the Dutch military, and they actually succeed in defeating Louis's army, and Louis is forced to withdraw from the Netherlands in 1674, having achieved none of what he was looking for. So if he had taken the deal when the Dutch were in agreement, he would have benefited from that war. But his stubbornness caused him to lose everything that he was looking for. Shortly after the Dutch War, we have something called the 9 Years' War, which I know is super annoying because we have so many blank years wars. But there we are, the 9 Years' War. And this comes about mainly because Louis had just created too many enemies in Europe. And of course, one of those enemies was this William of Orange, who had helped to liberate the Netherlands. And in 1688, William of Orange becomes the King of England, and we'll explain towards the end of this lecture how that comes to be. But William, now King William, pulls together an alliance of countries that are opposed to French expansion. Combined with that anti-French alliance, there are some internal problems in France. So there are a couple of bad harvests, which means you start to have famine. Uh, Inflation is very high, so things cost a lot of money and people don't have a lot of money. And there were a lot of military requisitions where the military just goes out into the countryside and takes people's property. So if you have to feed an army, then you go out into the countryside and you just take people's crops. And so then that increases the famine. And in the year 1694, 1 out of every 10 French people died as a result of that famine. At the end of this 9 Years' War, there is a treaty, and that treaty required France to give up all of the territories that it had occupied and to acknowledge William as the rightful King of England. So, pretty humiliating defeat for the Sun King. So, moving on to Spain, we see the last Spanish Habsburg die in Spain with no heir. Meaning that there's no one to succeed that king in Spain. And so now you have a problem of figuring out, okay, well, who's going to rule Spain? Spain was so poor by the late 17th century that it couldn't even pay for a funeral mass in the honor of the king. We saw in the 16th century that Spain was the wealthiest and perhaps most powerful country in Europe, but they misused that wealth. They used it basically to finance wars and buy luxury goods. They never developed a local manufacturing economy so that their wealth could be perpetuated. So that was a huge mistake. Now they still have this vast empire, primarily in the Americas, but because they have stripped all of the wealth out of those lands, they no longer really have any cash. So you start to see a power struggle between the two most powerful nations or leaders in Europe at that time, and that would, of course, be Louis XIV, but also the Austrian Habsburg Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold. They're trying to gain control of Spain. So, of course, Louis says, hey, it's right next to me, I should get to rule it. And the Austrian Habsburg, the Holy Roman Emperor, says, yeah, but that was a part of my family for a long time. Now, the last Habsburg king, the one who died, he secretly willed his throne to Louis XIV's grandson. And so that gave Louis some authority to say, yeah, actually, now we're going to be in control of Spain. Thank you very much. Needless to say, the Holy Roman Empire was not down with that argument. And so this actually triggers another war. The War of the Spanish Succession was a war between France and the combination of Austria, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. And the war was about control of the Spanish crown. And then, of course, if you control the Spanish crown, you control the entire Spanish Empire, including much of the New World. So France attacks the Spanish Netherlands and then pushes on to pose a threat to the non-Spanish Netherlands, the country we call today as the Netherlands. Louis uses his navy to cut off English access to the Mediterranean Sea. As a consequence of that, a combined Anglo-Dutch fleet goes around the world attacking the French forces in the Americas and in Africa. By 1709, Louis is losing the war. This combined alliance of Austria, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, they're right on his border. He's broke. France is in another famine. And a few years later, finally, Louis comes to the table to discuss a peace, and the peace is known as the Peace of Utrecht, which is a city in the Netherlands. Philip of Anjou, who was the guy that the last Spanish Habsburg king, had secretly willed the kingdom of Spain to. He stays the king of Spain, but the peace mandates that there will be no unification of the Spanish throne with the French throne. You're never going to have a combined France and Spain as one country. The Spanish Netherlands and Italy, or at least the Italian possessions of the King of Spain, those are transferred to Austria. So the Austrian Habsburgs are now in control of the land that we know today as Belgium. That's the Spanish Netherlands, as well as all of southern Italy and Sicily. That gets transferred to the Austrian Habsburg Emperor as well. And another consequence is that England gets three new territories in the Americas. Those would be the modern Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And they also get this tiny little spot of land at the southernmost tip of Spain called Gibraltar. It seems like, what's the big deal about Gibraltar? But Gibraltar is a high point that looks over a very narrow channel that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. England, or the United Kingdom, controls Gibraltar to this day. And that gives the United Kingdom, and prior to that, the British Empire, control over who can get into the Mediterranean Sea and who cannot. So it is an incredibly, incredibly important strategic point of land. So even though it's teeny tiny, it's very, very important. And it might have been the most important thing that England got out of the War of the Spanish Succession. We're now going to move on and look at Russia. The last time we looked at Russia, we were really still calling it Muscovy because they only controlled the territory in the immediate vicinity of the city of Moscow, which is the modern capital of Russia. So Peter the Great is one of the most important figures in the entire history of Russia, and he ruled in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And he really is the person who made Russia a European country. He brought a European style of government to Russia. Russia is very, very different than the other countries in Europe because it only had a population of about 14 million people and literally 1/40th of the population density of France. It was also pretty backwards in terms of its food production because it was only yielding about the same amount of grain as France had been yielding 800 years earlier. So not terribly sophisticated. 98% of the population were serfs. They were people who were tied to the land in a very primitive feudal system. And townspeople were really essentially just serfs who lived in cities. They were not allowed to leave their city. They were not allowed to have a different profession than their fathers had had before them. Personal rights just didn't even exist in Russia, not that they necessarily exist in large degrees in Russia today. Um, and the only people who could own land, the vast majority of the land was directly owned by the Tsar, so the only other people who could own land were nobles that were working directly for the state. And the only truly free person in the entire Russian Empire was the Tsar himself. 80% of all of the money generated in Russia went to fund a military of about 300,000 men. And the people who joined the army, that was a lifetime conscription. So once you're in the army, you can never leave. When Peter the Great became the ruler of Russia, Russia didn't have any ports. It was a landlocked country. And, landlocked countries have a difficult time ever becoming empires because if you want to be an empire, you need to have some authority on the high seas. So Russia goes to war against Sweden, which was the dominant power in the Baltic region during this period of time. Just as a reminder, the Baltic region is that which surrounds the Baltic Sea. And so on the map that is on the slide right now, the Baltic Sea is the sea that runs more or less north and south and is surrounded by Denmark, Sweden, Russia, Poland, and parts of Germany. That's the Baltic Sea. And so we refer to that area as the Baltic region. So in this war, initially the Swedes defeat Peter in battle and crush his army. But later in this war, this 20-year-long war, Peter is able to successfully defeat the Swedes and take what are called the Baltic states. So I know that's confusing. We have a Baltic Sea, the Baltic region, which is the region around the sea, and then the Baltic states, which are these three small countries which had not been independent for a very long time, but in the year 2020, these are independent nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So, in the effort to take those Baltic states, Peter is able to get an access to a port. And so at this point, starts to become a naval power as well as a land power. And by the end of the Great Northern War, Russia is the dominant power in the Baltic region, no longer Sweden or Denmark. Uh, and by the time that Peter died, Russia presented a formidable threat to the rest of Europe, and in fact, they were sometimes referred to as the Northern Turk, which is a reference to the Ottoman Empire and the way that the Ottoman Empire was expanding into Europe during this period as well. Peter the Great was a reformer. After he got control of the Baltic region, he built a new capital for himself right on the Baltic Sea called St. Petersburg. Inside of St. Petersburg, he built a very important, from a historical perspective, important structure called the Winter Palace. And we will see the Winter Palace again when we get to the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century. In order to streamline and improve the ability of the state to collect taxes, he divided the country into new provinces, and that allowed him to gather tax revenue more quickly and more efficiently. He also restructured the Russian Orthodox Church. He eliminated the patriarch, and the patriarch was sort of like the Pope, but for the Russian Orthodox Church. He saw that individual as a rival to his power, and so he replaced it with something called a Holy Synod. That's pronounced synod. And that's sort of like a council, but it was under Peter's control. So that's the most important part is now the Russian Orthodox Church is under his control and he no longer has a political rival in the leadership of the church. He also dramatically reduced the number of monasteries. He didn't eliminate monasteries altogether, but just as we saw in Western Europe, monasteries were a source of great wealth. And so when political and religious leaders decided to get rid of the monasteries, that allowed them to redistribute that wealth while taking a large share for themselves, of course. And the same thing happens in Russia. In addition to restructuring the church, Peter also built new schools. Those schools were, for the most part, staffed by Europeans and mostly Germans at that. They did translate the Greek and Latin classics into Russian, and he also founded something called the Russian Academy of Sciences, which was, in fact, almost entirely staffed by Germans. Peter worked really, really hard to westernize Russia. He was very enamored of Western European culture. He also reformed the Russian Orthodox calendar and the alphabet. He streamlined the alphabet that had been created for the Russian language several hundred years earlier. He also edited the first newspaper ever to exist in Russia. Now, of course, if you have the political leader as the editor of the newspaper, then you're probably only getting the news that that political leader wants you to hear. So, in that sense, the Russia of the 17th century is not dissimilar from the Russia of the 21st century. But when Peter died, Russia had been thoroughly Europeanized, and it was considered, as it is to this day, a European state. So we're going to move on to Austria, and we're now looking at Austria as being separate from the Holy Roman Empire, even though there is some overlap. And Where it gets confusing is that the monarch in charge of Austria holds three different titles. So one of those titles is the Holy Roman Emperor, but the Holy Roman Emperor at this point really only rules over the Habsburg lands, the lands in the empire that are ruled by the Habsburg family. The second crown that the Austrian monarch wears is the crown of Wenceslas, and that gives the Austrian monarch control over three provinces that overlap what is now Germany and the rest of Central Europe, and that would be Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia. And then the third crown that the Austrian, he doesn't literally wear three crowns at the same time because he only has one head, but symbolically speaking, is the crown of Saint Stephen, and that is what gives Austria power over Hungary, Transylvania, and Croatia. So it's a very unwieldy country. Uh, Basically, you have these three different groups who all accept the Austrian monarch as their leader, whether it is the emperor of the Habsburg lands or the king of the various places, Hungary and Bohemia and all those places. So it's really inefficient. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor, or the Austrian monarch, makes an attempt to, because he's Catholic, to impose Catholicism on all of his subjects. The problem is that some of his subjects are Protestants, and yet also some of his subjects are followers of the Greek Orthodox faith. So he's trying to get everybody to be Catholic. We've already gone through the Reformation. This is not a successful attempt. People are very comfortable with the religion that they have chosen. They never made any effort at integration. It was always accepted that Bohemia and Transylvania and Hungary, all these places are independent and culturally different and different languages. And there was no effort to try to streamline or unifying there. The only unifying forces in this entire larger Austrian empire is the actual monarch himself, is sort of a symbolic leader of all of those lands. And then the other unifying force would be the Turks, simply being united in opposition to Turks. And they had a holy mission to defend Europe from the Ottoman Empire. Now, they don't do a great job of that because in the 1680s, the Turks invade and they take half of Hungary away from the Austrian Empire. Hungary actually later on sides with the Ottomans because they don't like the ruler of Austria. Louis XIV gets into the game also because he saw Austria as a strategic enemy, and so he actually helps the Turks against Austria. He has to roll back on that a little bit when the Turks lay siege to Vienna, which is the capital of Austria. It still is the capital of Austria today. So that's how deep into Europe the Ottomans got in 1683. Is we're really talking no longer about Southeastern Europe. We're talking about Central Europe. That's how far the Ottoman Turks got into Europe. It's actually the Poles, the Polish people, who ride to the rescue and liberate Vienna in 1683. It was not the Austrians themselves that were the people who liberated themselves. It was the Polish people who liberated Vienna. By 1699, the Austrians have reached a treaty with the Ottomans, and they get most of Hungary back from the Ottoman Empire. So we have a new nation that comes into being during this period, and that is Prussia. I know it is a confusing name because it is not Russia, it is not Poland, it is Prussia, it is different. It started out as one of the many tiny principalities in the Holy Roman Empire, but after the 30 Years' War, it emerges as a power unto itself. The population is mixed between German and Polish. It's also mixed religiously. About half of the population of Prussia is Lutheran. The other half is Catholic, and it is also split in terms of the level of freedom of the common people. So the eastern half, basically the eastern half of Prussia, the lowest level of society, are serfs. Again, serfs are tied to the land. They do not have freedom of movement, whereas peasants are the lowest level of society in the western part of Prussia, the part of Prussia that's closer to northern Central Europe. And just like in Austria, the unifying force for a country that is divided ethnically, religiously, and in terms of freedom, that it's the ruler, it's the King of Prussia who is the unifying force in that proto nation. And you can see from the maps that it's not a contiguous nation, meaning that it's not just one piece of land the way that France is or the way that the United States of America is today. You have various pieces of Prussia that are spread across all of what is now northern Germany. So the early days of Prussia, they are dominated by three leaders who are all named Frederick, which is sort of confusing, and they all come from the House of Hohenzollern. So the first Frederick was known as Frederick the Great until his grandson came along and was the real Frederick the Great, and so they decided to rename the first Frederick the Great Frederick the Elector. Are you confused yet? So Frederick the Elector, he grew the army, he militarized society. Prussia was one of the most militaristic countries in Europe. When Prussia becomes the founding element of Germany, this is how come Germany was so militaristic up until 1945. So Frederick the Elector, he grew tax revenues. He did take money from some foreign countries, particularly France at certain points. And nobles didn't have to pay taxes, which is great for them and not so awesome for everybody else in society. But nobles all did have to serve in the army as officers. So a few years later, Frederick the First comes along, which is confusing because Frederick the Elector was Frederick the First. But anyway, so Frederick the First, he makes the military even more dominant. The army really is the state under Frederick the First, and society, all of society, revolves around whatever it is that the army needs. Troops don't live in separate barracks, they live amongst the population, and that actually helps reinforce the militarization of the whole society because you see soldiers and officers around you all of the time. And every male in Prussia had to serve in the military for 3 months out of every year. We're still in a period of history where wars are not fought year round. You have war season, and war season usually doesn't overlap with either the harvest or the winter because everybody needs to gather food and everybody needs to survive the winter. So usually wars are during this period, wars are not fought. There are specific seasons. And during the war season, every male was expected to go and fight. Frederick the First is followed by a man named Frederick the Great, who's the real Frederick the Great. And we're just going to say for now that he was really kind of the dominant leader of all of Europe in the middle of the 18th century. But when we get to that period in history, we'll spend quite a bit more time looking at Frederick the Great because he's really a fascinating historical figure. Stay tuned. So, to summarize absolutism in the East, when we're looking at Russia, Prussia, and Austria, most of the common people are serfs rather than peasants, other than a portion of Prussia. There is very little trade and there's almost no industry whatsoever happening in sort of Central and Eastern Europe. Most of that region, other than Russia, have few access points to the sea, and generally they are pretty envious of the wealth of the Western European nations. Remember, they totally, completely missed out on the colonization of the Americas, where Spain and France and England were all dominant. They missed out on all of that wealth, and they didn't. None of those countries really had a seafaring empire in the way that those three Western European nations do. So we're now going to look at England in the latter part of the 17th century, and specifically an event called the Glorious Revolution. As we know from a previous lecture, English history in the 17th century is dominated by the English Civil War in the middle of that century. At the end of the war, after the death of Oliver Cromwell and the deposing of Cromwell's son, Parliament invites Charles II, who is the son of King Charles I, the guy who was beheaded at the beginning of the Civil War. He is invited back to be the king again after this period where there is no king, called the interregnum. Interregnum is that word. And ideally, Charles was going to be this balance, right? There was going to be a balance between the king and the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So the House of Commons in the English Parliament is the lower house, and today in 2020, it's the only part of parliament that really matters. But back in the day, they also had the House of Lords, and there's a kind of a relationship between the House of Commons and the House of Lords that is not dissimilar from the relationship between the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives. So just as the Senate has to agree to anything that the House of Representatives wants to do, the House of Lords has to sign off on anything that the Commons wants to do. The House of Commons is an elected body, the House of Lords is not. It's a place for the nobility within the system of government. What they wanted is to have taxes to be authorized only by Parliament, that the king wouldn't have any say on new taxation. They also wanted to offer amnesty for anybody who rose up during the English Civil War. So, regardless of which side you were on, there was going to be amnesty. You weren't going to be executing people who rose up against the king. Uh, Charles II calls a new parliament, and he almost immediately gets rid of the religious toleration part of what they wanted to do. And now at this point, Charles is only going to allow for Anglicanism in the United Kingdom. So if you're a Presbyterian and you live in Scotland, well, you're going to lose your faith. If you are the descendants of the Puritans, you're going to lose your faith. So that was not terribly well received. Charles needed more cash because he had some wars he wanted to fight, but Parliament refused to authorize it because now Parliament has the sole authority to raise taxes. But that wasn't good enough for Charles, and so he secretly cuts a deal with Louis XIV to to become Catholic himself. Charles II would convert to Catholicism, and he would allow French troops into England to force the conversion of all of the English people. As you would imagine, when the plot was discovered, that was not a great look. So in modern history, we have talked about something called Brexit, which was the effort of the United Kingdom to leave the European Union. And there are some basic divisions within the British political system that existed in the 1600s and exist to this day. The political parties that existed in the late 17th century were the Whigs and the Tories. So the Whigs, they were very dominant in London and the other major cities of the United Kingdom. They were very, very interested in colonial expansion and commercial expansion. These were people who were merchants and people who, imperialists, people who stood to gain from the development of the colonial system. Their power base was in Parliament and particularly in the House of Commons. Again, the House of Commons is the only truly elected body at this point. And other than the colonial expansion aspect of the goals of the Whigs, these positions, sort of global integration, urbanization, those reflect very much the people in Britain in this age in which we're living that want to remain in the European Union. On the other side are the Tories, and the Tories are the modern Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom as it exists today, it existed over 300 years ago. It was the party that represented the rural areas of the country. It was the party that represented isolationism, meaning not wanting to get involved in war. And it was also most powerful amongst the aristocracy, the king's followers and in the House of Lords. And this is actually reflects very closely the attitudes of the people who wanted Brexit, who wanted to separate from the European Union, with some of the same attitudes and some of the same reasons as existed 300 years ago. All right, so Charles II dies. His son James II becomes king. Now, there's a problem here because he's secretly Catholic. And once he comes to power, he starts placing Catholics in key governmental positions. And that was enough to actually get the two political parties in England at that time to unite. So the Whigs and the Tories, they're on the same side, at least with regard to being opposed to Catholicism. And they actually call this guy who we've already talked about, William of Orange, to come to England. So it's the same William of Orange that was fighting Louis XIV and trying to defend the Netherlands from his efforts. The Whigs and the Tories combined ask William to come to England and become their king. And he's really seen, even though he's not an Englishman, he's seen as a liberator. James II bails on England. He heads to the Palace of Versailles in France, and Parliament declares William and his wife, who just conveniently is the daughter of James II, the Parliament declares William and Mary joint monarchs. And they also develop a new constitutional order. So there is a Bill of Rights in the United Kingdom in 1689, and some of the key parts of that Bill of Rights are that there will officially never be any taxes without the support of Parliament. You cannot be arrested without a warrant, and there's no such thing. You can't have excessive bail or a term that found its way into the United States Bill of Rights, which is there's a ban on cruel and unusual punishment. And another key part of this is that the king cannot in any way interfere with elections or limit free speech. William III takes power and he establishes an alliance with the Whig political party. He helps to get the Bank of England established as a central bank for the British Empire, and that will have huge ramifications for really all of world history. They come up with this concept of deficit financing, which is the national bank raises money not by raising taxes, but by selling debt. And we talked about this briefly earlier in the lecture. The idea is that you pay the government now a certain amount of money, and then 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, the government then gives you that money back plus interest. This is the basic way in which most governments fund their programs because most countries, including the United States of America, spend more than they take in revenue. And that presents long-term problems, but this is how we run our societies. William, working with the Whigs, unite Great Britain. And by doing what they do is in 1707 there is a union of the English and the Scottish monarchies, which turn it into the United Kingdom. Prior to 1707, we do not refer to England as the UK because it is the name the United Kingdom comes from the union of the Crown of England and the Crown of Scotland. Um, this all of the stuff that had been happening in Europe throughout the previous set of decades that gave the British Empire room to thrive. So, for example, they have less competition from both the French and the Spanish, and that gives the British Empire a lot of room to grow from a colonial perspective. Now, William and Mary had a daughter. Unfortunately, she passed without having born any children, and this gives Parliament another situation where they have to invite another European royal house to come in and help rule the United Kingdom, and they choose a German house called the House of Hanover. And the House of Hanover takes over again in the early 1700s and will be around until the late 1800s. And finally, we have a map of Europe in 1750. Why don't you pause the video here and just take a look at the degree to which, for example, Russia has grown. France looks very much like the borders that France holds today, and the Ottoman Empire is still a major player in Southeastern Europe. Thank you for staying until the end of my lecture.